Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is the iPad Cat, and welcome to the 9th episode of my The Last of Us Could Have Been Very Different series, where we reconstruct and discuss one of the original storyboards from the game's development. If you just happen to come across this video out of nowhere, I'd strongly recommend that you watch the series chronologically, because well, otherwise it probably won't make much sense. Anyways, in this episode, the storm is but a memory, and the final destination is closer than ever. So let's not delay any further.
Let's get on with it.
After the tumultuous event at the Colorado Mountain Lakeside Resort, Joel and Ellie had slowly, but relatively incident-free, made their way into Utah. And just as spring started to reclaim the land, they finally reached the outskirts of Salt Lake City. A year had passed since Joel first got thrown into this whole mess. At first, he wanted nothing more than to cut his losses and run. But now, he found it hard to imagine a world without it. As the pair walked down an old highway exit leading into the city, he worried over what the Fireflies were going to do to Ellie. What would it take to synthesize a vaccine? Ever since his conversation with Tommy about Rachel a few months back, the memory of her had regularly come back to haunt him. What if they just turned around and made it to some place where they could settle down and be done with it? After walking down the ramp onto a smaller street with what looked like a baseball field at the end of it, Joel realized he had been totally caught up in his thoughts. Ellie wasn't beside him anymore. Turning around, he saw her still on the highway ramp, looking at an old faded advertisement on the side of a bus. He called out to her, but it didn't seem like she heard him.
Ellie!
Maybe it wasn't only him that had second thoughts about doing this whole thing, he thought, and started walking back toward her. Once he reached her, he said her name again, and she looked up at him, surprised, and responded with, huh, as if she'd been daydreaming.
Did you hear me?
No. What?
Slightly concerned, he asked her if she was okay. She'd been more or less this way since they left Lakeside, so obviously something wasn't right. But he didn't want to come across as confrontational. She'd been driving him insane with her constant joking around and chirpiness, but now it wasn't there, and it made her seem like another person. Ellie said she was okay and continued walking forward down the street. As they went up toward the baseball field, they passed multiple destroyed military vehicles. The Fireflies had definitely been there at some point, Joel thought. But so far the only signs of them were remains of street fights with Fedra and the odd graffiti here and there. The only clue they had to go on was from a man who had most likely been dead for a long while, saying they kept some old hospital somewhere in the city as a base. Surely a force like the Fireflies would have regular patrols this close to their headquarters. The whole situation was getting worryingly similar to the university. He felt like he was starting to go crazy from all the constant pondering on the mission, if it could even still be called that. Fortunately, he didn't have to think about it anymore, at least for the moment, as Ellie burst out in awe of seeing something up ahead. She turned around with excitement and asked Joel if he saw that. Confused, Joel said that he didn't. Ellie started jogging toward the overgrown baseball field at the end of the street. Joel, having no idea why, but glad to see Ellie happy, or at least seeming that way, followed her. The part of the fence that was visible from the street they were on was heavily overgrown with all sorts of plant life. But as they rounded the corner, Joel could almost not believe his eyes. The rest of the fence had fallen down, revealing the entire field behind it, and on it was a whole herd of giraffes feeding on the tall grass and the trees that had started growing on it since the end of the world. Ellie ran up to the edge of the field and stood smiling in amazement at the majestic animals. She turned to Joel with a grin on her face and told him how cool she thought it was. They both leaned onto an old Fedra APC, sharing the moment in silence. As the giraffes gradually moved away and out of sight on the far side of the field, Joel felt his heart sink once again. The Fireflies were no hunters, but he knew from dealing with them in the past that they stopped at nothing to achieve their goals. He just couldn't shake the feeling of this ending badly. So he turned to Ellie and asked her if it wasn't better if they could just be done with it. Leave and go somewhere safe.
We don't have to do this. Be done with this whole damn thing.
Ellie waited for a while, as if she were analyzing what he had just said, and then turned to him and asked if they were really going to abandon the only thing driving them forward during the past year, after everything they'd been through and sacrificed to get here.
After all we've been through, everything that I've done.
Joel certainly knew that he was prepared to do that, but realized Ellie wasn't of the same opinion. He sighed and said that they'd best get going then. Walking out on the field gave a great vantage point of the city. He told Ellie to look for anything that might be the hospital they were looking for, as he looked around himself. Less than a minute later, Ellie pointed out that a big, modern glass building across the field had a red cross sign. That had to be it. Joel told her she did great finding it, and they both started trekking across the field towards it. A few minutes later, they crawled out of a hole in the baseball field fence, but before they could do anything, a voice over a megaphone yelled at them to stop right where they stood. They both stopped. The voice demanded that they drop any weapons on the ground. They obliged and threw their bags and weapons down. Up ahead, from what looked like what might have been the main entrance to the hospital once, 2 men wearing bulletproof armor, yellow shirts, and the iconic Firefly armband, armed with automatic rifles, came running out and picked up their belongings. At least they had arrived at the right place, Joel thought. As the Firefly grunts returned to the entrance, the voice demanded to know why they were this close to a Firefly base. Ellie stepped forward to try and say something, but the guards at the door aimed their guns at her. She stepped back, raised her voice, and said that they'd come from Boston because she was immune, and that she was the key to finding a vaccine. The man on the megaphone asked if that was the case, why Marlene, the doctor, and several more Fireflies weren't escorting them. Joel broke in and said that things went badly in Boston, and that they were all that's left. The man didn't answer, but the 2 guards came back and ushered them into the hospital lobby, and closed the doors behind them. To their surprise, the electricity was on. Up ahead, by what must have been the reception, was a partly functioning lit sign reading Salt Lake City University Hospital. The voice that had questioned them a moment ago became a person when a white-dressed man stepped out of a just-arrived elevator from a higher floor. He was escorted by 2 additional Fireflies. He told them to forgive the heavy presence of guards and said that they'd had problems with bandit attacks recently. He continued by introducing himself as the temporary chief of the Firefly HQ while Marlene was out, as well as the head scientist and doctor. And maybe even the leader of the Fireflies, if what they said about Marlene was true, he added. This was obviously a man who cared way too much about useless titles, Joel thought to himself, as he simply grunted to acknowledge he had heard what he said. When he finally stopped talking, Joel asked about what would happen now. The scientist turned to him and said that he assumed Joel was the smuggler who was supposed to take Ellie out of Boston. Joel nodded skeptically. The man then continued by saying they'd confirm if Ellie was the real girl they heard about, and if she was immune, after which Joel would be compensated and asked to leave. The scientist looked at his watch and seemed a bit stressed. He asked Ellie what her name was and told her to follow him. Joel started going after, but the Fireflies by the elevator raised their guns. He demanded to know what they would do to her, and when she'd be back. The scientist turned around, looking surprised, and asked why he cared. Joel was losing his patience, and said that he did care. Ellie was looking nervous, standing in the elevator. The scientist seemed to ponder what to say before telling him it wasn't his business, and that he could either stay in the lobby or in the area to wait for his payment, and then be on his way, before closing the elevator doors. As the doors were closing, Joel yelled for Ellie and rushed toward the elevator, but was bashed in the head by the butt of one of the Firefly's rifles, and blacked out. Joel opened his eyes, his head aching from the hit. It was very dark outside, although the moon provided some light, as well as the hospital standing out like a sore thumb with its electrical lights on the otherwise dark Salt Lake City skyline. From where he was standing, it seemed like they had just dumped him on the baseball field. On the ground beside him was his backpack, revolver, and a closed duffel bag, presumably his payment. Joel mumbled the worst swear words he could come up with as he opened it. Inside was a few cans of beans, some shotgun shells, and a few shirts. So much for losing everything and traveling across the country, he thought. He didn't care about what the Fireflies were going to do to Ellie. Regardless if the process was harmless or lethal, he couldn't just leave her there to live with a group of borderline terrorists. And losing her would leave him in ruin. He clenched his revolver with his right hand and started reloading it. He was going to get her back, no matter what. He started sneaking back towards the hospital. There had to be other entrances than the lobby he was in before, since there was no way he was getting it that way. He arrived at the edge of the baseball field after a few minutes. The Fireflies didn't have a lot of guards outside of the hospital, but they had made sure the place was barricaded for nothing short of a war. Most possible entrances he could see were blockaded with rubble, barbed wire, wrecked cars, and proper walls. He stayed where he was for a moment, scanning the building for any potential way to break in. It was hard to see during the night, but after a while something finally caught his attention. Along the wall to the left of the lobby entrance, maybe 100 meters straight forward, was another barricade. But behind it, the Fireflies hadn't bothered removing some old rickety scaffolding leading up to the second floor, where he probably could force open or break a window to get in. He used the dark as cover to effortlessly get to the barricade. Looking up, he could see that the scaffolding had seen better days. He hadn't exactly had the best experience with these things as of late, but he had to do it. Carefully he climbed over the barbed wire and began to very lightly ascend the rusty stairs leading up to the second floor. The metal was creaking and sounding all kinds of bad under his feet. Falling now would probably have much more dire consequences than what happened at the university. After a few intense seconds, he reached the second floor. There were no open windows he could see. However, the wood holding them closed was rotten. Joel pushed it until eventually the locking mechanism just passed through the wood like butter. He was in. Just as he closed the window behind him and started sneaking forward, he heard a very loud crashing sound. He looked back and saw that the scaffolding had fallen apart. Voices started shouting further away in the hallways, but he heard them mentioning that something had happened on ground level outside. What could have been disastrous became a very handy distraction. Joel continued down the hallway he was in and saw a crossed over sign reading gym. Why would the hospital even have a gym, he wondered. But then he realized that this was a university hospital, so it made sense. Under the crossed over text there was something spray painted. 3 letters. Lab. It said lab. That's where Ellie must be, he thought as he followed the gym signs. There were still a few Fireflies he had to avoid, but most, at least on this floor, seemed to have been called to investigate the scaffolding. After walking the hallway maze for a few minutes, he arrived. The doors were shut, but not locked. He could see bright lights through the windows in the doors. What were they doing? He carefully pushed one of the double doors open, and what he saw inside horrified him. There was the smug, title-loving scientist and 2 others standing over a hospital bed with Ellie in it. She was wearing a hospital gown and didn't seem to be conscious. He had to get her out. He felt the anger boiling up and shouted her name. The main scientist turned around and simply burst out, "You!" The sadistic hunter within Joel rose to the surface, and he almost put a smile on as he raised his revolver. But he didn't. The scientist grabbed a surgical knife and backed off, telling Joel to stop, but Joel didn't care, and fired off a shot to his head, killing him instantly. The other 2 scientists seemed terrified and stayed back. He didn't care about them. Ellie was the most important thing. Seeing the car garage after exiting the elevator was strange. Either the Fireflies had kept it religiously maintained, or it was simply totally untouched by the end of the world. A lot of cars were parked there, and with unconscious Ellie in his arms, Joel jogged by them to see if any still had the keys in them, but quickly realized it was wishful thinking. He carefully put Ellie down and broke the window on a nearby car with his elbow and hotwired it. He put Ellie in the backseat and pushed the gas as hard as he could. Just as they exited the garage, the Fireflies had finally gotten into it and managed to break the remaining windows in the car with the few bullets that they managed to fire off before Joel had turned out onto the street. Only one headlight was working, but it was enough to see the wrecks blocking his way on the road. The Fireflies were surely coming after them, but he got enough of a head start to at least breathe for a moment. He lowered the speed slightly as he approached a roundabout leading to several highway entrances. He grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the massive sign to see which way to go. He saw San Francisco and an arrow pointing to the left. That was as good a place as any, as long as they were far away from the Fireflies, cannibals and hunters, he thought. Just as he was about to speed up on the highway, he noticed several headlights appearing behind them. There was no way the Fireflies had caught up already. But it wasn't the Fireflies. As they got closer, Joel saw a mix of cars and motorcycles. Tess. Alright, we're really getting close to the end now. But, for now, it's time for some discussion. I know it's almost becoming a joke at this point, since I mention it almost every time, but there isn't a lot here. Though this time I really mean it. This entire episode is based on this tiny segment on the storyboard, with 4 post-its in total. However, there is one main thing I do want to talk about, and that is the location of this entire sequence. Notice how there is only one single actual real-world location mentioned on the storyboard. At the very end, which we'll get to in the next episode, it says San Francisco Vista. But everywhere else it's unspecified. There is no mention of Austin or Texas in the prologue, it's just called City Street. There is no mention of Boston, it's just called Military City. There is no mention of Pittsburgh, instead it's called Hunter City. And there is no mention of Wyoming or Jackson. I can't quite read what it says, but it certainly doesn't say any of those things. You get the point. What I'm trying to say is that in the entirety of these reconstructions, I've been picking locations based on what we got in the real game, and I think I might have done so pretty accurately, except for with this part. And that is because we know from Naughty Dog that the ending was supposed to play out in San Francisco. But they haven't really specified it more than that. What counted as the ending? What we're about to talk about in the next episode only? Or does it include the whole part with, the Cure and the Fireflies? You know those things that most of the game's motivations were based around? Because I can't decide if the Fireflies were supposed to be based in San Francisco or another city like Salt Lake City. The way San Francisco Vista is placed at the very end of the storyboard makes it seem like they just arrived there, and then the ending credits roll. So why the hell am I even arguing about it then? Well, the game was supposed to end in San Francisco as stated by the developers themselves. And we know for a fact that there is, or at least was relatively recently, a canon Firefly presence in San Francisco from the sniper's note at the university. Maybe that was also a thing when the lab was supposed to be there, and they left it in after they changed it to Salt Lake City. I don't know. This is the only location I feel is very up in the air, and I really have no idea where it might be set. Did the developers mean that just the very end of the game, like the epilogue in the actual game, was supposed to end in San Francisco? Or did they mean the entire ending act? It's driving me crazy thinking about it. But hold your thoughts about it and post what you think in the comments in a second, because that's all we have time for today. Aside from what I just asked you, did you think I did a decent enough job of reconstructing this part of the story? Do you think Marlene being replaced with a nameless scientist makes the sequence less powerful? Tell me in the comments down below and let's discuss it. And until next time, have a great day.